Well, welcome everyone. My name is Paul LaChapelle. I'm on the Board of Trustees of the IACD, the International Association for Community Development, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to our webinar today. I just want to remind you that we are recording. You heard that announcement at the beginning there. I do want to say that our webinar is a joint IACD-CDS, that's the Community Development Society event, and this is being hosted by the IACD North America region. You'll be hearing from our speakers who will be telling you a bit more about themselves and their role in the book that they'll be talking about, and they'll also be posting a little bit more about themselves in the chat. We also encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat as well. Just a brief statement about who you are, where you're from, anything else that you'd like to share with our speakers and with each other. I do want to highlight for our webinar today that we are coming from a place where all people are respected, and we just want to remind you of the community development values that we all share. Again, at the end of the webinar, we'll have an opportunity for asking questions, either through the chat or you will have an opportunity to unmute yourself and ask our speakers questions directly. With that, I'll be very happy to turn it over to our speakers, Dorgham, Tzvia, and Esther. So please take it away.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Paul. So just a little bit about this project. It has quite an interesting history. It started out as a storytelling project from Jewish Voice for Peace in New York City. And the mostly Jewish members of the chapter began telling our stories of our relationship to Zionism in our families. And the stories were quite rich. They were varied. They were also very painful. And we came up with a small book called Confronting Zionism. For me, as a theater person, these stories were just screaming to be performed. And so we created a readers theater project called Wrestling with Zionism. And then a very wonderful thing happened. Our Palestinian friends and partners asked to tell their stories, and that changed everything. The show became equally Jewish and Palestinian, of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish faiths. So we performed the show around the New York City metropolitan area, and in the performance of the stories, some wonderful things happened. Whereas the issue is usually impossible to engage without rancor, the stories created an environment where people could hear each other, to be curious and really talk. And we often had to kick people out after the show because people didn't want to leave. They were so engaged with each other. So there was a lot of interest, almost a demand, that we create another book with all of these amazing stories. And that's how A Land Where the People was born. So to start us off, we want to show you a 4-minute, very short video, a promotional video of the show, Wrestling with Zionism.
Growing up in Israel in the 1990s, there was never any particular moment when I started being a Zionist, just like there was no moment when I started being a Jew. Being a Zionist to an Israeli Jew simply means being a good citizen.
My father was 8 years old in 1948. The family lived in Ramla, city of central Palestine. My family were thriving farmers. We lived in a peace, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, celebrated each other holidays and worked together. After the Balfour Declaration, everything changed. Palestine was partitioned, and although the Zionists got almost 60% of the land, they wanted more. They occupied the city of Lod, and many Palestinians were killed. My family went from being farmers owners to being refugees in camps, to being homeless and stateless. My dad just started to share his stories because after 69 years, his wounds started to bleed. He has nightmares when he screams and wakes up horrified.
My ongoing struggles with Zionism have been defined by the fact that it was Zionism in the first place that radicalized me. It was in Zionist education that I learned to develop a critique of society and to think about how race, class, and gender contribute to privilege and inequity in my daily life. I'm not proud of how long it took me to reach my current convictions about Zionism. And yet, I cannot regret the attachment to Israeli society that my education afforded me.
I was born in Romania during World War II. I grew up in Tel Aviv and spent years on a kibbutz. As a liberal Zionist, I prided myself on my progressive values. I was against wars, racism, and discrimination. I did not know how much I didn't know. The population in Israel-Palestine is divided about half and half, Jews and Palestinians. Yet, I did not have one Palestinian friend, acquaintance, or neighbor. The Palestinians are on the dark side of the moon. Do you know that in Jerusalem city maps, Palestinian neighborhoods are blank, as if they don't exist? It has been hard work to examine my own mind. My solid identity has been shaken and then broken.
I am a Palestinian American whose family has lived in the West Bank for over 400 years. I also have family in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, Israeli soldiers are everywhere. When they see my Palestinian name, they treat me like a criminal. They pat me down and check my bags. It's stop and frisk, Brownsville, Brooklyn style, every single day for Palestinians. I remember seeing a group of Israeli soldiers going up to a young Palestinian man and slapping him around and calling him names. He looked scared and confused. His hands went up to shield his face. My instinct was to protect him, so I walked toward the Israeli soldiers. One of the soldiers came up to me, put a gun to my head, and said, "Do you want to die?" I would show my face in this video, but I fear for my safety. We've been threatened because we're Palestinian and because we're Muslim.
My father was born in Hebron, Palestine. He always identified as a Palestinian Jew. He was very Jewish and very anti-Zionist. People are generally surprised by this, but there are a lot more of us than you think.
I wanted to learn. I wanted to see.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Okay, so with that, we're going to start telling a little bit more about our stories, and I'm going to turn it over to Tzvia Thier, who, as you saw, is a contributor to the book, and we're lucky enough to have her. So, Tzvia, take it away.
If you read in the book and if you watch the movie, so you know that I was born in Romania and that I lived most of my life in Israel. And as you could see, I considered myself a liberal Zionist. And but I didn't know any of the Palestinians. It's hard to believe, but I didn't have one friend, one neighbor, one acquaintance, nobody. I only heard about the Palestinians when they live side by side with me. It was November 2009, when I heard on the radio the two Arab families, we used to call them Arabs, not Palestinians, God forbid them. Anyway, that two Arab families were evicted from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. I didn't know where Sheikh Jarrah is because I never ever went to any Arabic neighborhood. I was afraid. We were told that Arabs are dangerous, they are killers. If you go there, you can be killed. Now, Sheikh Jarrah is side by side with the French Hill neighborhood, and I lived in French Hill. I didn't know that the neighborhood next to me is Sheikh Jarrah. I heard that there is protests in Sheikh Jarrah against the eviction. At first, I was afraid to go there, but eventually I did go. And it was when I was 65 years old, the first time in my life that I spoke truly with Palestinians. Before that, they were there, but they were not. I didn't see them. They were cleaning the streets, they were doing work, but I didn't know any of them. The thing is that very moment, it's kind of, the bubble broke, and I didn't wait. I wanted to know. I started to go, I went to East Jerusalem, and I realized that this is not the city I know. It was a third world city. I went to the West Bank. I wanted to see what their life is like. I went with the, I went to Hebron, where the apartheid, it's in your eyes, you see it. Eventually, I ended up joining Tayush. We went, Tayush are people that work together with Palestinians in South Hebron Hills. And they go there at least once a week on Saturday. There are people that go more than that. But Saturdays, I joined them and I realized what life is like to be under military regime. Half of the population in Israel are under army regime. Of course, about Gaza, you will hear later, because to Gaza I cannot go. It's locked. It's a prison. The thing is that what I don't understand, I didn't understand then, and I mean, I understand and I don't, how people know and they don't know. I mean, in a way, I knew that there is a problem, but I didn't know more than that. I started to search myself. But people that are nice people, my best friend, she is a nice, intelligent person. And not only she doesn't know, but she doesn't want to know. This is the thing, she doesn't want to know. When her first grandson was supposed to go to the army, I wanted to give him a pamphlet of breaking the silence, soldiers breaking the silence, and they didn't let me give it to him because he was supposed to go blank, not knowing anything. Really? I worked in schools. Soldiers come to the schools, they pick handsome officers and soldiers, they come to school to tell the kids what they can do in the army, what is the best way to join the army and to benefit out of it. And they don't want to know. And I mean, people that are not stupid, educated people, the indoctrination is so strong. As of me, it started in first grade when I came from Romania, all the way, everything. History books, it's history of the Ashkenazi Jews in East Europe. The Bible is a history book. I mean, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they started Judaism. Whether they existed at all or not, I don't know. But everything is connected to the Jewish people, connected to the land. The land is ours. It was ours 2,000 years ago, and the people who are living right now, it doesn't belong to them. 700,000 Palestinians were kicked out, which I didn't know. I didn't know the word Nakba at that time. It took time to know that there was a Nakba. There is more to add to that. I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tzvia. The power of storytelling. I'm going to hand this over to Dorgham.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Tzvia, for sharing your story with us. And thank you, everybody, for being here. My name is Dorgham Abusalim. I am a contributing author to the wonderful anthology that Jewish Voice for Peace New York had recently produced. My chapter specifically recounts one of the few times I was able to return back home to the Gaza Strip. When I was 16, I left home in pursuit of education, and ever since I've only been able to return only 3 times, primarily because, as Tzvia had mentioned, the Gaza Strip is often referred to as an open-air prison that is the making of the Israeli military regime. It's very difficult for Palestinians who are from there to go in and out and travel freely, because freedom of movement is not a right that we enjoy like much of the world does. So my story recounts the time I returned there in the summer of 2014, which unfortunately, as some of you might recall, was also a time when the Israeli regime had launched quite the severe and catastrophic assault on the Gaza Strip. So my account really is a portrait of human interest that recalls simply my interaction and my engagement with that reality, having been away from home for so long. And I say human interest because, you know, Tzvia had raised a very interesting question. How is it that people know yet don't know, or don't necessarily act in a way that you would think is the sensible or logical way? And I think part of it is, at the root of it, really, not part of it, is the logic of Zionism. As a political thought, as an ideology, historically, Zionism simply proposes the supremacy of Jewish people over others. That's it really in a nutshell. And for that to function, you do categorically need to dehumanize the other, i.e. strip Palestinians of their humanity. And therefore, they're not worth the attention or the action that would be sensible and logical and predictable in such circumstances. So people might know, but then again, when these communities have been dehumanized, then you can't expect action to aid them and support them in their struggle against apartheid. So I think, you know, that's really the crux of the issue here at a very fundamental level, the proposition of Zionism and what that means and how it manifests itself. Today, for example, on the question of the Gaza Strip and freedom of movement, it is very difficult for people to go in and out, no matter what their circumstances are, no matter what their statuses are. And I bring this up because the apartheid regime so far has yielded 5 ID systems that are dividing the population throughout the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, historic Palestine, Israel, or current Palestinian territories. And those 5 IDs pretty much define how you move and how you are, you know, addressed or handled by the military regime. Of course, Israelis have the better end of the spectrum as full citizens with full rights. And then, of course, it goes all the way to those who have the least amount of rights and are confined, and their human rights are almost constantly violated. And it really is based on again, that logic of demographic control using different ID systems that impact freedom of movement, that impact access to services, that impact your ability to marry, that impact your ability to purchase property or land, that impact your ability to access municipal services, such as having water to your place or being the trash having picked up, and all these things that, you know, to many people around the world are mundane, but for us in Palestine are quite significant. And the way they manifest themselves is really quite violent as well. You know, Palestine and specifically the Gaza Strip appear in the news when it's flashy enough, certainly in the West here in the US and in Europe, when there is an actual military campaign by the state of Israel assaulting the Gaza Strip. But past that, you don't hear much about the fact that Israel deliberately cuts the electricity for extended hours of time in the Gaza Strip, which impacts hospitals and people receiving critical care and these kind of things. Israel deliberately cuts the water supply. Israel deliberately limits freedom of movement. And all these things, every little act is an act of violence that is a byproduct ultimately of the Zionist thought. And for us really, and I think for people in the audience as community developers and professionals in community development, the question begs itself: how do we move forward from this point? And how can we take this on genuinely, authentically, meaningfully, and with impact? And I think it begins with recognizing that Zionist thought is one that is supremacist, and it really privileges people of a certain group, in this case, Jewish people, over others. And it's very critical in any sort of community development to recognize that power dynamic and try and dismantle it to achieve not only equality, but I think equally important, equity among the stakeholders. Certainly in the work of solidarity and advocacy. And this is something that we see in the example of many organizations on the progressive side of things, including Jewish Voice for Peace, who is an organization that is clearly anti-Zionist in their work. So I'm going to stop here and then we could discuss further with the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dorgham. So let me share a little bit of my story. As you saw in the film, I'm a Palestinian Jew. When I say this, sometimes people look at me like I have two heads. And that's because the narrative, the dominant narrative coming out of Israel is that there is no such thing as Palestinians, literally. There has been a deliberate erasure of both Palestine and Palestinians in the dominant narrative. So in fact, when Israel was created, the trope said, Israel is a land without a people for a people without a land. Hence, that's the name of our book, A Land with a People. There were at that time 2 million Palestinians that were living there, almost half of which were kicked out in 1947 during the Nakba, the catastrophe. So before Israel was created, Palestine was a country of both Muslims, 80% were Muslim, 10% were Christian, and 10% were Jews. Everyone who lived there were considered Palestinian. My father was born in Hebron. My grandfather was a progressive for his time Turkish Jew who went to Palestine because he was against war and he didn't want to serve in the Turkish army. But unbeknownst to my grandfather, Palestine was colonized by Turkey under the Ottoman Empire. So he was drafted anyway. That's why the family came to New York. My grandmother had always lived in Palestine. Her father was an herbalist pharmacist whose patients were Muslim, Christian, and Jewish. My grandmother always used to say that the Jews got along fine with Muslims in Palestine. Excuse me. They celebrated each other's holidays. They were friends and neighbors until the British got involved. It was very interesting in the research for the stories in the book. I was quite amazed that so many people describing this time had a similar story. So for the most part, there was very little anti-Semitism in Palestine, with none of the angst that was experienced by Europe's Jews. And this is quite important because, as my father would say, Palestinians were made to suffer for the Holocaust when they had nothing to do with it. The British involvement that my grandmother mentioned was the Balfour Declaration. That paved the way for Palestine to be partitioned, colonized, and turned into a state specifically for Jews. And by the way, Balfour was a known anti-Semite. This wasn't out of the goodness of his heart that he loved Jews so much. He wanted to get rid of them. And ironically, this kind of echoes the Christian nationalists that we see today, 100 years later, who are quite anti-Semitic, but they seem to love Israel and Zionism. So hence the title of the story in my book, which my father used to say all the time, is that the Zionists love Israel, but they don't love Jews. So he identified as a Palestinian Jew, and he was extremely anti-Zionist. My family was very anti-Zionist. Their objection to Zionism, firstly, that Palestinians should not have to pay for European crimes. Secondly, he felt that you can't have a state where one people dominate and call it democratic. And finally, that Israel was oppressing Palestinians in the name of Jews, and therefore no one would be safe from the war that this would create. So as Dorgham said, that was the beginning, that was the essence of what this issue and what this problem is about. We cannot avoid looking at what has happened from this very time that Israel was created. So my father also saw the role of the United States at that time, which was embroiled in all kinds of imperialist ventures, and he felt that Jews were being used by those imperialist interests. So along with our anti-Zionism in my family, we were very culturally Jewish and very lefty. The family story is that my grandfather tried to prove that socialism was ordained in the Talmud. So my very existence gives the lie to the myth that to be anti-Zionist means being anti-Jewish. In fact, before the Holocaust, there was substantial opposition to Zionism among Jews, and our book reclaims that history. So I've been a social justice activist my whole life, and the values that I learned in my family were that never again means never again for everyone, and that justice does not mean just us. So many of the Jewish contributors to this book have had to come to grips with the disaster that Zionism has wrought, as Tzvia and Dorgham have described. And that spiritual transformation that the brilliant Palestinian scholar Noura Erakat talks about in her foreword to the book has allowed the Israeli and Palestinian contributors to this book to have a new kind of trustful and trusting relationship. And that opens the door to a more hopeful future. So with that, I would love to open it up to questions and some dialogue.
Thank you, Esther, Dorgham, and Tzvia. We do have plenty of time for questions, so you can go ahead and type them into the chat, and I'll encourage our speakers to review those, or feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like. Would anyone like to kick us off?
You know, I'm just going to ask a question of people just to start thinking about this, but it's a topic that people are sometimes quite afraid to say anything. So I'm kind of wondering, what are people afraid of in asking a question or making a comment about some of the stories? What do people feel nervous about as a way of maybe even start thinking about this?
I think it's really important to differentiate between being anti-Zionist versus anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. I think they're totally different things, which this program is showing, but we have to keep making that point, because when anybody who criticizes Israel and their treatment of the Palestinians is not anti-Semitic necessarily, but they're very, very concerned about human rights and what Zionism apparently empowers people to do to others.
I think that's such an important point, Cornelia, and thank you for raising it. And it's been an uphill battle because the charge of anti-Semitism has been so weaponized that people are so scared that if they say anything, they're going to be called an anti-Semite. And that's been a deliberate, there's millions and millions of dollars behind this from AIPAC and a serious concern. You can't say anything. Now, it's getting harder and harder for that narrative to continue because the major human rights organizations in the country, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, has pretty much said Israel is an apartheid state. But it is still very difficult for people to come together to talk about this, and that's one of the reasons why.
Esther, there are a few questions in the chat. Go ahead and address them if you'd like, if you want to read them out.
Dorgham, do you want to take the first question?
I see, yes.
Around peaceful? Yes.
Right. How do those engaged in peaceful protest interact with Palestinians who employ violence? How do you address this tension? Well, I'm going to step back and ask probably a question in return, exactly what is meant by Palestinians employing violence here. And I raise this rhetorically because our experience, as the evidence shows throughout nearly a century of being colonized, that the violence that occurs is in fact self-defense. We defend our land and our families and our people as any other people would do around the planet. It's nothing extraordinary or out of the norm around war. Now, is it something I personally endorse? Not necessarily, but I mean, what else could anyone expect in a state of war, right? The violence that we see isn't one that emerges in a vacuum. The violence that we see is a byproduct of a century-long campaign to erase our communities, our history, our families, and our culture, and our deeply rooted ties to the land. So that violence certainly does create tension, and the question of addressing it becomes all the more important when it comes to work around, peaceful advocacy or civil work or community advocacy and conversations, even such as this one. How do we address that tension? I think one effective way to address that tension is by recognizing that that violence does not emerge in a vacuum. Palestinians aren't just hanging around waiting to blow up. That stereotype is so racist and so repulsive in its roots that, quite frankly, makes me think that the propaganda machine is still quite at work, and that really needs to be addressed effectively and meaningfully. Because at the end of the day, when you have a state of war, as we have seen most recently with Russia and Ukraine, for example, and we can point to the wildly different portraits of how Ukrainians are resisting Russian invasion and occupation versus how Palestinians are resisting Israeli invasion and occupation in Western media specifically. So again, when we ask these questions, it is important to always take a step back and see how these questions actually came about in the discourse and how they have been raised and employed to really stifle the conversation and corner Palestinians into this idea of them being irrational savages, violent, bloodthirsty terrorists, when the reality is simply the opposite of that. Palestinians, like everybody else around the planet, are doing what everybody else would do in these circumstances. As I am sure, when all of your families are under fire from a nuclear power, you would be more than prepared to defend them. And that's just the reality of it all. So it is important for us to think, all right, this violence does not emerge in a vacuum. Let's look at the root causes. the root cause is, again, Zionism and a supremacist ideology, and how has manifested itself throughout the years, you know, with a segregated system, different ways of controlling Palestinians and their lives and oppressing them and violating their rights. Then, okay, how do you go about addressing these questions? I think one of the tools that JVP and other organizations have discussed quite widely is the idea of boycotts, sanctions, and divestment as far as peaceful activism is concerned, right? To boycott something, to sanction something, and divest for something is a right and a practice that has been proven, whether from South Africa or other countries, to take really its effect and deliver impact. Now, of course, we know that the advocacy around BDS for Palestine has been met with the charge of anti-Semitism. So again, there is that tension and how you navigate that, which I'm sure Esther could highlight further.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Dorgham. You know, BDS has been brutally attacked. They're even trying to make it illegal, like the idea of a boycott. So in a way, you look at this and you say, what do you want Palestinians to do? What should you do? It's terrible if somebody throws a rocket or something, you know, or a stone, and don't do boycotts either. So you're literally saying that there is nothing that Palestinians can do to address this situation. It's really, I think the context and the fact that the propaganda has been so intense that we see how we see Palestinians as the violent ones when it's been Israeli society that's been so incredibly violent. I did want to answer another question or continue this dialogue around what is the answer? Do we advocate for a single state or whatever? And just to put that a little bit in context, you know, for so many years, there was this thing about the two-state solution. Well, the reality is that the Israelis have literally taken over, I think it's 90% of the land at this point with settlements, which under international law had been illegal. And even the United States has said that they're illegal. Nevertheless, they've expanded and expanded and expanded. And now there's nothing of Palestine to be a second state. So it was Israel that destroyed the two-state solution, if that was ever a viable answer to this. I don't feel personally, I think Tzvia and Dorgham might have a different answer to this question, but for me, I don't feel like people in this country should have, we don't have the right to say what the answer is. The answer is that people there have to decide what the answer is. However, I do feel like the work that needs to be done is to counteract this narrative that we're talking about and to do the kind of transformation work that this book talks about, that Noura Erakat talks about. And one of the interesting things is she talks about how there needs to be a transformation within the settlement movement, within that very Israel, because people have to live together. So I think this book makes a contribution to the change in that narrative, and that's what's most important to me. Tzvia, you might have another thought, or Dorgham, you might have another thought about the answer, and I know we have some hands also that were up.
Well, of course, I don't have an answer to the question, two-state solution or whatever. What I wanted to say about that, Lapid is now the Prime Minister of Israel, and he had a talk at the UN that everybody applauded. He again raised the solution as two-state solution. Two-state solution, it means what? To have for the Palestinians Bantustans, as it was in South Africa. I mean, the West Bank is filled with Jewish settlements. It is just saying that two-state solution, so there is not possible to do that. And the Israeli Jews are so scared of one state with Palestinians and Jews, my God, with Palestinians. the sad joke is that if you ask a Jewish Israeli in Israel, what is your best dream that you can have, is that they will wake up in the morning, no Arabs in the country, just disappeared. Well, it won't happen. And I don't have any answer for any solution. I just wanted to say that in terms of being a human being is to live as a human being among human beings, whether they are Palestinians, whether they are Ukrainians, whether they are Polish, whether they are Americans. We are just human beings, and we get to be scared of one of each other instead of living together.
Yeah, I know we have a hand. Dorgham, did you want to make a comment about this? Because I know you talked. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, one thought I have here, and this goes back to the past quarter century with the Oslo Accords and the two-state solution scheme and all these things, all of which were simply promissory at best. I don't think any of it was intended to yield the proclaimed results, as the evidence clearly shows. And, you know, the Prime Minister of Israel, I don't know if Tzvia or not, if you've seen it or not, his very notorious Facebook post recently, where he explicitly states that the two-state solution isn't something that he's interested in. Nor is he interested in making any compromise with Palestine, primarily because, and he points to it quite accurately actually on his Facebook, saying that, you know, we haven't made any compromises and we're still very comfortable, and we've actually made strides with many people around the world, pointing to normalizing relationships with the Arab world, with some countries, ongoing support from the US and Europe and all of these things without having to make compromise. Point being, the current status quo is very comfortable for Israel, despite the flash news that you might see every once in a while. The occupation is not costing Israel a whole lot. The apartheid regime is not costing Israel a whole lot. So it's a very comfortable reality for the leadership and the government and the way it is foreseeing its colonial project, because they have not felt any consequences or any cost to it that would be the byproduct of things like boycotts, sanctions, and divestments as a peaceful tool should the world governments pursue that. But so far, unfortunately, that has not really taken root. On the question of the overall answer, if you will, I think, you know, this is sort of an scapegoat. No one could really point to a particular answer at this point, simply because the circumstances and the environment are not ripe for that. I think the work that all of us should be focusing on is the work that enhances and supports dignity, human rights, solidarity, justice, equity, and equality. And it begins with recognizing the wrongs that were committed against Palestinians. Mind you, in 100 years of this conflict, not once has the world recognized the wrongs that were committed against us. That wrong begins with the expulsion and eradication of our people to the tune of nearly 1 million people in 1948. That wrong must be recognized and must be addressed by the state of Israel and its allies everywhere. And then we can talk about what the end game might look like. But again, you can't really arrive at a material solution without having to address these fundamental questions that are on everyone's mind in Palestine. You can't expect me as a Palestinian to sit with you on the table in confidence and in good faith when you have not recognized what you have done to me. That's just never going to work, nor has it ever worked historically. This is a bizarre thing. Why is it that Palestinians are expected to do something outside the norm of how these things are addressed? And again, it is part of our dehumanization and part of us being treated as less than worthy of what is standard in international relations, right? No, we're not. We're human, we're equal, and we are going to get there. We would like to get there. We are proposing an inclusive future, unlike the exclusive future of Zionism. But for us to get there, you must deliver and you must build confidence with us and show us that you actually want to do that. So far, the state of Israel has shown us no evidence whatsoever that it wants to move forward, unfortunately.
And let's be very clear about this, just to add to that passionate statement, which I completely agree with, is that the United States gives Israel $3.8 billion a year of taxpayers' money to continue this. If that ended, that would make a big dent. So a lot of what goes on in Israel is totally funded, backed up by the United States. So one of the things policy-wise that's very important is that we end that. I know Rick had his hand up for a long time.
Yes, in the spirit of folks in Palestine/Israel coming up with the solutions that the rest of us can, buy into or follow. How easy is it for someone like Tzvia to speak up, to come together in a group and to discuss issues as she laid out in her introduction? How safe is it for contradictory narratives to surface in Israel by Israelis?
Tzvia, do you want to? Yeah.
How safe it is to speak out in Israel? Well,
yes.
In
yes.
Israel, the majority of the people, absolute majority of the people, are brainwashed about anti-Palestinians, and we are such a small group that the most we can do is going to South Hebron Hills to work together with the Palestinians, or to go to the Jordan Valley and to try to protect the Palestinians there. And we started to be attacked as well. When I say we, I'm not there anymore. I'm here in the United States. But I do know that Jews that think like I do, and they join the Palestinians, they get beaten as well. I mean, they became so cruel. There is no room for me to talk to people. I remember I was so naive when I discovered the truth. I was walking on the street and see people sitting down, enjoying their coffee on a nice day. And I was thinking, don't you know what's happening just a few kilometers from here? No, they don't know. And I have no place to try and to say something. It's not a matter of being safe or not. I mean, nobody will listen to me. As I said, I wanted a young man to have a pamphlet of breaking the silence, and they didn't want to read it. One of my friends, that she is a PhD, very highly educated in chemistry and whatever, she said, don't you know that the Palestinians want to throw us into the sea? I mean, who threw? The Jews were the one who threw the Palestinians to the sea. That's why they are now the refugees in Lebanon and Syria and so on. But I have no place to, I cannot talk about these issues with my own sister. She thinks she's left, and she is afraid of Palestinians as everybody else. Who should I talk to? I don't talk to anybody, except of the very few that think like me.
Well, one thing to give maybe a positive spin on that, in Israel, it's very difficult. It's a lot easier for a Jew, not easy, but easier than it is for a Palestinian who was literally threatened with their lives to speak out about this. But I will say that in the United States, the narrative is changing in a major way. We recently got into a synagogue for 2 sessions, a large synagogue of 600 people in California, and we did a book talk, and it was quite wonderful to see that people are questioning they're questioning this. So the narrative is definitely changing here, and that's what we want to continue. That's the purpose of the book, to change that narrative. It, as I said, it's much more dangerous for Palestinians to speak out here or anywhere. You know, an interesting story is that I spoke at a women's rally in New York City, and all I had to do was say that I was a Palestinian Jew. There was a group of Israelis in the front, and they just started booing and calling me a traitor just for saying the word Palestinian. So, I mean, that is the level. The good news is that we have been doing storytelling workshops throughout the country, and in the stories, it allows people to talk to each other in a new way. It's not a polemic. It's not a political discourse. It's a story. And if we can respect people's stories, it's one way of breaking this kind of thing where you're not allowed to even have a conversation, as we're doing right now. So that's why I think storytelling is such an important aspect of changing that narrative. There's a question here.
Esther, Marcia's asked a question. I'll read it out loud for all of us to contemplate. Marcia asks, do you see any movements or organizations that are making progress with changing Israeli mindsets and policies that oppress Palestinians? Are there any Jewish people who speak out for the rights of Palestinians in Israel?
I could chime into that question based on my knowledge, and Esther and Tzvia could also add to that. I think the work of changing Israeli mindsets is not going to be incumbent on the few Israelis or the few Palestinians who are engaging in good faith with these questions. I think, you know, if you look at it in recent years, survey after survey after survey, and Tzvia could probably talk to this as well, the Israeli mindset and the Israeli take on this is going rightward. So this is just the reality of it. So and in Israel, you have organizations such as Daesh, B'Tselem, and other organizations that really raise the alarm and point to the red flags in the problems that we've discussed today. But changing the mindset from within is not going to be a way forward, in my opinion. I think that to change the mindset, for the occupying power and how they have positioned themselves, that is something that is incumbent on all of us abroad as activists, advocates, analysts, writers, and movement members to really advocate for policies that will sway the state of Israel in a direction other than the current one. And BDS is one tool to pursue that, and at the very grassroots level to the very high level to change mindsets. So that would be one thought here.
There are organizations such as Breaking the Silence, which Tzvia mentioned earlier, of young people who are refusing to serve in the army in Israel. So that's also happening there. I think the dialogue is changing certainly much faster here among American Jews than it is in Israel. Tzvia, you can say if there are other organizations that you know of.
Well, as was mentioned, B'Tselem and Yesh Din, and not too many. No.
Yes.
Yeah, international pressure is going to be one of the things that is so important.
And Breaking the Silence and Yesh Din, though they do a very important work, they are still Zionists. I want you to know. I don't know if B'Tselem will say it openly that they are anti-Zionist, because you don't dare to be anti-Zionist in Israel. But B'Tselem are the nearest to be anti-Zionist, especially that B'Tselem, they have Palestinians that do the job. But there is no a strong organization that can cope with the Zionism of Israel. And it can come only from outside, and I don't see how it comes from the outside when the world goes to the right side. I don't know what will be the future, but I still think that the only thing to be done is outside, to work outside, to put pressure on Israel. But as I said, who am I to have any solution? I don't.
There's a question here, which I think Dorgham would be helpful in answering, around who were we do think this is an issue of indigeneity, of indigenous rights, absolutely. Dorgham, do you want to respond to that? I know we only have 2 minutes.
Right, I'll be very brief and only recommend a recent book actually that delves into the history of the land for about 4,000 years. So it's called Palestine, A 4,000-Year History by Noura Erakat. And the book is actually quite wonderful. I have a book here and I have a copy here and I've been reading it. And it delves into the history of that land and all the civilizations and all the cultures that have gone through, taking on that lens of indigenous people, but also it also discusses something that I think is very relevant to us, which is the idea of nationalizing the identities of the indigenous people, right? The Palestinian nationalist movement, the Arab nationalist movement, the Zionist, and therefore Israeli nationalist movement. All of these are really recent bits of the history. Although you will find consistently throughout history, Palestine has been the mark of the land, Philistine, Philistia, Palestina, different iterations of the name of the land really remained consistent throughout, which is quite miraculous if you think about it in terms of, history, archaeology, and all the civilizations that have ruled and colonized the land over time. And it takes us to the present time. Yeah, I do agree with Esther. It is a question of indigeneity and, and how, and colonialism, because if you recall, at that very point in time in 1947 with the League of Nations, 1948, and later, of course, the United Nations, the second iteration of that international project. But at that very point in time, much of the world was being decolonized. A lot of the countries in Africa and in Asia and elsewhere were being decolonized and granted independence from the major colonial powers. Palestine probably is the one case where it was practically recolonized, unlike everyone else during that time period where the modern nation state emerged and then later evolved into the United Nations from the League of Nations, right? So Palestine is still in a way stuck at that time in history, and it is a conversation about colonialism, imperialism, and how we want to decolonize the country. Of course, it has taken many different shapes and forms in modern times, but this is what the thinking is with this book as well.
Thank you. Okay, well, it's 2:00.
Yes.
We are at the top of the hour. I would, if Esther, Dorgham, and Tzvia, if you'd like to stay online, I know we are just about out of time here, but perhaps we could entertain a few additional questions if you're all amenable to that. For those of you that do have to exit, we want to thank you for joining us today.
Maybe Mayor can put in the chat a link to buy the book again. Yes, thank you.
Wonderful.
If you're interested.
Any parting words, Esther, from you or Dorgham or Tzvia? We'd love to hear about any future opportunities to learn and to interact. If you have any upcoming events that you could share with us.
Yeah, I mean, we'll certainly share with the IACD and CDS upcoming talks that we do. The book has been really well received. We're very pleased with how it's really engaged people in new kinds of ways. So the value of storytelling is not only important because it changes the dialogue and changes the narrative, but also it changes people's relationship to each other. And that's what we've noticed in doing the theater project and in doing the book. The relationship between the contributors has gotten really close, and that would be impossible under any other circumstances. So we're really proud of that and very grateful that you guys invited us as community developers to take on this issue. It's not an easy issue to take on, so thank you.
Parting words from Dorgham or Tzvia?
whether I'm willing to be engaged in other projects in the future. Certainly I am. Any project in the future that I can speak out and talk from the point of view of a Jewish Israeli anti-Zionist that saw the truth at the age of 65. I mean, all my life I was a Zionist. I was a teacher. I taught Zionism to my students. My God, this is what I did. So can I change it now? Whenever it's possible, I will do it.
And Dorgham, we'll leave you with the last word if you'd like to share anything with us.
Well, thank you so much. I think this was a wonderful conversation, and I'm really grateful for all the questions that people in the audience raised, and grateful for the opportunity to speak to you all. It's not often that somebody from the Gaza Strip has the opportunity to address such a diverse audience who are interested in this conversation. So that's always a good thing. And hopefully in the future, we'll have more opportunities to work together. And of course, thank you to Esther and Tzvia for their great remarks and contribution as well. Always a pleasure to work with you all.
Wonderful. Well, with that, we'll conclude our formal webinar. Again, I'll invite anyone to stick around if you'd like to ask any other follow-up questions. But with that, we'll conclude our recording. And I'd like to thank again our speakers for their time, sharing their wonderful experience and wisdom with this work. Thank you all. And until next time, on behalf of CDS and the IACD, thanks for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.